Good morning. Incidentally, there will be no lecture on Friday. Brother Damien and I are going to, we are attending a funeral. Father Gerard died. So the next lecture will be on Monday. Today, let's take, there was one little item. Remember when we were comparing Hegel and Marx regarding Napoleon? Remember Napoleon? Okay. According to Hegel, there had to be a Napoleon. A Napoleon. Okay, as Marx puts it over on page 63, that middle paragraph, it is not history which uses men as the means of achieving, right? Remember Hegel's notion of the List der Vernunft. In other words, the cunning of reason. In other words, God using human passions and emotions in order to achieve his ends, etc. It is not history which uses men as means of achieving, as if it were an individual person, its own ends, right? History is nothing but the activity of men in pursuit of their ends. Okay, according to Hegel, a Napoleon had to have arisen because of the social situation in France at the time. Not according to Marx. Marx, who created Napoleon? Napoleon created Napoleon, right? As he says, history is nothing but the activity of men in pursuit of their ends. Okay, that's a little piece of unfinished business. And okay, now today we want to get into something about Marx's theory of economics. And Marx actually made contributions to the theory of economics, but we'll get into that later. The classical, this is over on page 62 at the bottom. The classical economists, namely Adam Smith and David Ricardo. Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations. They have a singular way of proceeding. For them, there are only two kinds of institutions, artificial and natural. Feudal institutions are artificial, according to classical economic theory, whereas those of the bourgeoisie are natural. Well, anyway. So what do they determine? Okay, the classical economists establish what are called the laws of supply and, supply and demand. Okay, first of all, what is demand? Demand is the relation between price and quantity. And supply is how much the market can offer. Okay? These are, according to Marx, as he says on the next page, the eternal laws. These are the eternal laws of supply and demand, according to the classical economists, Smith and Ricardo. Marx does not agree. Marx maintains it is production that creates demand, right? In other words, what he's saying is, if you produce it, people will buy it. Now, well, I mean, after all, I don't have one, but I've heard of them. The iPhone, okay? If you create and produce the iPhone, people will buy iPhones. That's Marx's point. Or think, what?
A better example would be fidget spinners. Nobody wanted them until they were created.
I was just going to mention similar. Remember the hula hoop? If you manufacture the hula, and all of a sudden people want hula hoops. Or the pet rock, oh my gosh, think of the various fads that, I mean, Marx has a point, and I think he's to a great extent right. Well, the internet, for heaven's sake. Okay. And the access that we have to the internet. Okay, that's a bit on classical economic theory and Marx's take on it. He doesn't like Smith and Ricardo. In fact, he spent most of his time in Paris, or first in Paris in 1844, and later in England at the British Museum, studying the classical economists in order to counteract their views. Okay, let's take a look at, let's erase this. Okay, let's take a look at what revolution. Okay. On page 64, okay? In the development of the productive forces, a stage is reached where productive forces and means of intercourse are being called into being, which, under the existing relations, can only work mischief. What have we got? We got mischief. And which are therefore no longer productive but destructive forces. Okay. Okay, what are the ingredients? What are the ingredients of a good revolution? Well, in this particular section, he outlines basically three. A class which comprises the majority of the members of the society, okay? The majority. Okay? A class that is the majority. And in which there develops a consciousness, right, of the need for fundamental revolution. Okay, the majority, well, what is this majority? As he says, which is not recognized as a class, but which is the expression of the dissolution of all classes, nationalities, etc., within the contemporary society. In other words, what he's talking about, the underclass, right? It's not really a class. It's he uses the colorful German word Lumpen, proletariat. Okay, Lumpen means rags and tatters. Okay, this is the class that lives in rags and tatters. They're Hollywood cast. They're cast for the part. Okay. So, in which there develops a consciousness of the need for a fundamental revolution. This consciousness can, of course, also arise in other classes from the observation of the situation of this class. In other words, what you need is, for a revolution, you need, first of all, you need a, well, the class against which the underclass is going to revolt, right? We'll call that the upper class. Well, and then you need another ingredient you need for a revolution, you need the intellectuals. Okay? What are the intellectuals? The intellectuals, let's take a look over on the next page. He says, okay, as long as they are looking, the bottom the sentence there, second sentence from the bottom on 66. As long as they are looking for a science and only create systems, as long as they are at the beginning of the struggle, they see in poverty only poverty, without noticing its revolutionary and subversive aspects which will overthrow the old society. Right? In a way, the people who are living in rags and tatters don't even see their own poverty. I mean, they live in the midst of it. They don't even notice the odor, among other things. And that's what you need the intellectuals for. The intellectuals are the ones who point out not only that this is not the way things have to be. This is not the way things have to be. In other words, there may be a better way. And of course, the revolution is necessary not only because of the ruling class, okay, upper class ruling, not only because the ruling class cannot be overthrown in any other way, but also because in a revolution, can the class which overthrew it rid itself of the accumulated rubbish of the past and become truly capable of reconstructing society? Of course, as we saw earlier with Hegel, there are no successful revolutions. Marx, of course, believes that it is possible. We can get rid of all the collected, accumulated rubbish that preceded. Okay, he returns to the whole issue much later, and we get added a few more. What are the ingredients of a good revolution? Okay, you need the majority of let's call them the oppressed class. Okay. And then, instead of the upper class, we'll call that the ruling class. We'll call this, you need an enemy, right? And of course, the enemy is going to be the capitalist, right? Let's go a little further. Proletariat and wealth, that's capitalist. Proletariat, right? The lumpen proletariat and wealth are, needless to say, are antinomies, right? In other words, they have nomoi, laws and customs, anti-nomoi, right? Laws and customs that are opposed to each other, right? Radically opposed to each other. So you're going to need, for a good revolution, you're going to need an oppressed class, the lumpen proletariat, the ruling class, or the enemy, which you're trying to overthrow, and you're going to need intellectuals, right, who raise, what do intellectuals do? They raise the consciousness of the oppressed class, indicating that this is not necessarily the way that things have to be. Right? And then finally, you need people who are trained at the university in chemistry. In other words, you need people to, the dynamite, right? If you're going to blow something up, you need dynamite, and you're going to need a chemist. So, okay, now, notice these intellectuals are not members of the oppressed class. In fact, quite often they can be members of the ruling class who sympathize with the oppressed members of the class. Okay, so that gives you some idea of what you need in order to achieve a revolution. Yeah. Okay, over on page 232, he says, the last sentence in that top paragraph. If the proletariat triumphs, this does not mean that it becomes the absolute form of society. Uh-oh. For it is only victorious by abolishing itself as well as its opposite. You know, you have to get rid of the enemy, but you also have to get rid of this, not only this lumpen proletariat class. In other words, you have to get rid of their rags and their tatters, but also the mentality that they have. Because remember, for Marx, it's not life, it's not consciousness that determines life, life determines consciousness. So if you change the life, you change the consciousness. So, for it is only victorious by abolishing itself as well as its opposite. Thus, the proletariat disappears along with the opposite, which conditions it. Okay. Let's take a look over on. Of course, the classical economists would say. The classical economists would say that everyone has equal opportunity in a society. Well, theoretically, yes. Practically or actually, doubtful. Let's take a look over on page, here it is, page 79. The ideas of the ruling class are in every age the ruling ideas, right? Well, in other words, the ruling class has control of the media of communication, right? In other words, the ruling class owns the newspapers, the television stations, etc. Which means they control the ideas, right? So the individuals composing the ruling class possess, among other things, consciousness, and therefore think, oh yes. Insofar, therefore, as they rule as a class and determine the whole extent of an epoch, it is self-evident that they do this in their whole range. And thus, among other things, rule also as thinkers, as producers of ideas, and regulate the production and distribution of ideas in their age. In other words, they determine, for example, what books are going to be published because they own the publishing houses. They determine which programs are going to appear on television and which are not. And they control the media, basically. The ruling class does. Consequently, their ideas are the ruling ideas of the age. For instance, in an age and in a country where royal power, aristocracy, and the bourgeoisie are contending for dominance, right? In other words, where you have three different classes basically running things, the doctrine of separation of powers appears as the dominant idea and is determined as a separate law. However, according to Marx, economics determines everything. Going a little further, the division of labor, which we saw earlier, remember, white collar, blue collar, which was in one of the principal forces of history up to the present time, manifests itself also in the ruling class, in the division between mental and material labor. So that within this class, one part appears as the thinkers of the class, the ideologues. Well, I mean, for example, in economic, in any above all, capitalist economy, you're going to have economists. And of course, there are two varieties. There are progressive and conservative, right? Okay. So in other words, they're not. It's not a monolithic ideology in a particular economy, right? There are going to be differences of opinion, and of course, among them are those that are progressive. I could mention a few names, but they're dead. Anyway, this cleavage within the ruling class may even develop into certain opposition and hostility between the two parts. Well, I mean, for example, we have Republicans and we have Democrats, right? However, whenever there is a crisis, right? In other words, a crisis relative to an attack from a foreign power, for example, the Democrats and the Republicans all get together against a common enemy. Similarly, well, I mean, for example, now, even though Democrats and the Republicans disagree on exactly how the stimulus package should be shaped, they agree that there has to be a stimulus package, and they are coming together. Whether it's fully activated, I'm not certain. They are coming together to produce some kind in the face of the coronavirus, right? Which has not only political implications, but above all economic implications, and so. Okay, let's go a little further. Over on page 81, the more the established form of intercourse in society, and thus the conditions of the ruling class come into conflict with the developed productive forces, right? Again, you're going to get both conservative and progressive economic theories as to how things are going to be done. And the greater, therefore, is the dissension within the ruling class itself, and sometimes the Republicans and Democrats are literally at loggerheads. The less veridical, naturally, the less truthful, right, naturally becomes a consciousness which originates from and expresses this forms it ceases to express it. Okay, it can happen that the laws of supply and demand are going to need a certain amount of, shall we say, adjustment. As Marx was on to say, the earlier conceptions of these relations of intercourse, the laws of supply and demand, in which the real individual interests were asserted as general interests, right? Decline into mere idealizing phrases, conscious illusions, or deliberate deceits. Well, for example, there's the American dream, right? which Marx may be correct in describing as an idealizing phrase. There was a whole body of literature when I was growing up. The Horatio Alger novels, right? They were about a young man who, because he was honest, forthright, and industrious, achieves success, economic success, right? Financial success. The American dream, right? It was inculcated into the American psyche early in life, in the Horatio Alger novels. Okay, the kind of idealizing phrases, conscious illusions, and deliberate deceits. But the more they are condemned as falsehood, and the less they satisfy the understanding, the more dogmatically they are asserted, and you too can achieve the American dream. Or in another political context, it might be the party line, right? And it also has a national, I mean, the English would hold something important to be honor. And of course, they spell it differently. Or if you were de Gaulle speaking to the French, you would say de Gaulle. You would gloire, right? A French translation of English honor. Okay, let's go a little further, and then nope, we don't want to go there. Do we have any time left? Mm-hmm. Okay.
We've been going for 30 minutes.
Well, what we have to get into shortly is a thing called labor. Labor, and above all, money, right? So maybe we better stop, and we'll pick it up again on Monday.